I know that we thought it was going to be an early session today, but I'd like to just add a couple of words to the statements that have been made today. Really, the quick message that I was going to give is that over the last couple of years since we've been in this Senate chamber, there have been a multitude of questions that have been asked and left unanswered. And I bring that up because it's happened again today, from the standpoint that if a statement is brought to this honorable chamber and questions are asked, you would expect that there would be an opportunity to hear that answer. In another place, there is a process that happens, but it seems that in many cases, and I'm not going to say in all cases, because today we actually heard some of the junior ministers go out of their way to get answers to questions. But it's difficult when a complicated statement is written that has a lot of figures in it and questions are asked that are important to the country. When it, we've heard several times this morning about the impact that it's having on our country, the economy, and the impact that that is having when it comes to the violence with our young people. All of those pieces are connected. So when we ask the questions, it's really so that we can have an understanding that everything is being done possible in order for Bermuda to be in a better place. That's not to point a finger directly at any person, because there's a lot of people that work hard to pull together the plans, to do the work that it takes to implement plans. But Madam President, having a plan that isn't actually implemented, or having a report done where the information is not used, isn't helpful. And then when we come here and we're asking questions that don't get answered, once again, not helpful. So, Madam President, I just want to point out a couple of things. So recently, there has been communication to our community about passports, what's happening with passports in Bermuda. And I know that anybody that has been trying to get a passport recently, because obviously with 2 years of COVID, the amount of travel had been curtailed significantly, and now people are starting to move around again, and they're realizing, oh, I needed to get my passport renewed. And that process already had been increased to 11 weeks, which was a long period considering what it had been previously. And now we're hearing that number has been 20 weeks, and I'm hearing narratives that in some cases that number's been significantly longer than 20 weeks. Well, Madam President, I bring that up in light of also hearing messages from the restaurant community that says that they are potentially downsizing in some restaurants because they can't get their work permits approved. And I'm also hearing that there has been long delays in work permit approval across the board. The reason I bring that up is because a former minister who was heading up the bipartisan Immigration Reform Committee, Honorable Minister Keynes, and I was on that committee at the time. I know that he reached out and hired a private company to look at the inefficiencies within the immigration department. And he reported back to the committee that there were very significant inefficiencies in how that process happened from step one to the final destination. And that was for work permit approval, and that was also for passports. And the reason I bring that up is because we fast forward now when he hasn't been the minister for a significant amount of time, and we're hearing increases in the amount of time. So we seem to be moving in the wrong direction. So I asked these couple of questions to the government. How much money did we spend to the private sector to go through the process of finding out where the inefficiencies are? And what is the plan to implement the changes so that we can reduce that time? The reason you ask that is because we've had the minister come out and talk about growing the resident population and doing everything we can to increase the business in the country and bringing outside income to the country so that we can increase the job opportunities for our locals. But if we have a logjam that is preventing that business from growing, and we are seeing issues where now we're having to bring 10 more people into a department in order to get back to a normal level, which is already too long, how are we fixing it? And this goes to the question. So I'm asking that question. It'll be interesting to see if I get an answer to that question. Madam President, we've heard several of our senators today talk specifically to the gang violence in Bermuda. I know that everybody here in this chamber has continued to be touched by the way this increase in gang violence and violent crime in Bermuda is impacting our community. Everybody's being touched by it in some way. It might not be exactly in your neighborhood, but Bermuda's tiny. It's all our neighborhood. And if we don't all start to put our hand up and say, well, how can we help? How can we change this? Then we're just as to blame as my colleague, Senator Tucker, was saying, that there's some families that have been turning a blind eye. If we are not willing to speak out to it, then we're just as guilty. If we're not willing to make the changes, then we're just as guilty. Well, Madam President, we have heard over the last few months that there are students as young as 8 and 9 years old that are being brought into gangs, socialized into that gang culture. I ask a question. With all the changes that are happening within the education system, please tell us what the plan is, not the national security plan, the education plan of how we are going to deal with these young people that are being preyed on by this negative part of our community. Once again, that's a question. Where's the plan? What are the details of the plan, and how will it be implemented? Because we cannot continue to lose our young people, and we're losing them younger and younger. The result is the death of these young Black Bermudians that we're seeing on a much too regular basis. But the damage is being done at 8 and 9. That is setting them up to not be a productive part of our society because of the impact that's happening to them at a very tender age. We need to know that there is a plan in place and that we have all of the resources that is needed in order to implement that plan to change what's happening in our country so that we can be in a better place. One child loss is too many. But Madam President, if you go back and talk about the statistics over the 20 years, and I believe the 72 people that have lost their lives, but that number is much bigger than that. Look at the people that have left the country because of the impact of being part of this lifestyle. The parents that have lost their child, the husbands or wives that have lost their spouse, the children that are now impacted by the trauma of losing a parent. It continues on and on and on. So those are some of the questions that I'm asking. And Madam President, it is our job to continue to ask these questions and to seek the answers. And if we don't get the answers the first time, I'm going to have to keep reminding us that we're not getting the answers. We know that the situation that Bermuda's in right now is complicated. But it's not the time to pat ourselves on the back for all these wonderful things that we're doing when too many people are suffering. Far too many. Across our island. We all see the food banks. We see the articles in the paper. It's not just the gun violence, it's the knife violence. It's the continuous videos being sent around the island of people getting into fights and getting beat up and all the bullying and things that are happening in our community. It is continuous. How is our older population going to continue to be able to pay for their health care and buy food? Yes, it is important that there's been an increase in the pension, but at 2.5% or 2.75% when the food increase is at 8.5%? We can freeze the gas price for a certain amount of time, but at some point that avalanche is coming. So we have to start to actually have an open conversation with our community. It's not about scaring them. It's about preparing them for what is needed for all of us to survive what's coming. The changes that are being implemented will take a long time. But the now, the present, that's going to be a struggle. We can't bury our heads in the sand and pretend it's not happening and try to blame it on somebody else and point fingers at each other and say it's their fault and this is what happened, because of a small amount of time that another party was in place. None of those things are going to matter when people don't have money in their pocket and they can't pay their bills. They're not interested in that. It's our job to come here and figure out how we can do better for our entire community and for the generations that follow. So, Madam President, I ask again that we can start to get the answers to the questions that are being posed in this Senate chamber and not just a note that's given to a senator weeks later, but a way for the community to know, because the questions we're asking are important. And they're being asked by not just the opposition senators, but also the independent senators, and they're going unanswered. The same way that you want to celebrate and pat yourself on the back for the successes, you have to stand up and answer the tough questions. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you, Senator Van Smith.